Hello and welcome back to the channel and to another video about the Zettelkasten note-taking system. If you aren't already familiar with the Zettelkasten style of note-taking and knowledge management, you might want to visit one of my other videos first. Namely, I have a viral video on the topic which starts from the absolute basics and a lot of people have found really helpful. Basically though, in a Zettelkasten system, you make many bite-sized or atomic notes that each express a single idea, and then you connect between those notes. So you have what is kind of an interconnected network of knowledge, almost similar to how our brains are actually working. Because the knowledge is managed by connections and not by some top-down model or in a series of notebooks, the notes that we need emerge when we need them because they're connected to the notes that we're working with. And the Zettelkasten system essentially has two separate types of notes. You have notes, like atomic permanent notes, which are your ideas. This is your knowledge base. And then you have your bibliographic notes, or what I tend to call your source notes. And that's where you got all of the knowledge, or much of the knowledge, in your permanent notes. Personally, I predominantly use a note-taking app called Obsidian, and within Obsidian, I have a folder called Sources. And that is where I stick all of my bibliographic notes. And then my bibliographic notes all have connections to the notes that they refer to in my main Zettelkasten area. So with that context out of the way, I wanted to address a viewer's question about when you actually need to create a specific note for a source. This question is coming from Giancarlo over on Instagram. If you have questions about the Zettelkasten system or how I use it, feel free to jump over to my Instagram. I'll link it below and ask me those via DM. But Giancarlo asks, do you always make a new note with the name, year, title, formatting of the note name for every single reference that you've made in your Zettelkasten? So like, I've pulled a quote or a piece of data from, etc. No matter how small that data I've extracted from it is. In other words, is there time where I will put knowledge in my Zettelkasten from a source, but not create a source note for that knowledge? And the answer might be surprising. The answer I would say is yes. There are times where I don't make a source note, even though there's a piece of knowledge in my Zettelkasten that source note would connect to. However, it's very rare, and if you're unsure whether you should create a source note or not, I would recommend creating the source note because it's not going to hurt the system. Remember, in a Zettelkasten system, the more notes we have, the more effective the system is, as long as we're interconnecting them regularly. So when in doubt, create the source note, but there are times where it might not make sense to. It might just be a waste of time, and we don't want to do that either. Every single time you put a new note into your Zettelkasten system, you want to ask the question, what does this connect to that is already in my Zettelkasten? And if the answer is nothing except for this one thing that I'm inserting it into my Zettelkasten for, then maybe you don't want to make a source note for that reference. Like if it's only ever going to connect to this one idea that's in this one atomic note, maybe we don't need a source note for it because the only time I'm ever going to need that source is when I'm looking at that specific idea. And I'm not going to find that through a source, I'm going to find that through the idea itself. So as long as I'm putting a link there to the website where I found it, or I'm putting in the book's bibliographic information in that atomic note, then maybe I don't need to copy that information over to a source note because now I just have two notes for only one piece of information. An example of this might be when, say, you're looking for examples of an idea. For instance, I'm really interested in how people use juggling as a metaphor for things that aren't literal juggling, because I myself am a literal juggler, but the word juggling is used to describe more things than just the physical act of manipulating objects in the air. So let's imagine I have a note called Juggling as a Metaphor in the Media. And in this note, really all I'm doing is listing the times I've noticed somebody use the word juggling in the media as a metaphor for something that isn't throwing and catching. For instance, there's this 2024 article called Barcelona Protesters Demand Affordable Rents as Spain Juggles Tourism Impact. Now, I'm not particularly interested in tourism or how it affects affordable rents in Spain. However, I am interested in how that title of this article uses the word juggle. So I'm probably not making any other connections to the actual content of this article. I literally just want it for the title itself Same thing with this article called Global Markets Juggle Rate Speculations and Nvidia's Big Reveal. Again, this is not in my primary area of knowledge collection. I've also got 5 tips to juggle work-life balance in agriculture. I'm not in agriculture. I don't need to worry about how people juggle work-life balance in agriculture. I just want this as an example of how people are using the word juggle as a metaphor in mainstream media, because maybe I'm going to write an article about that topic. So if I look at these 3 articles and I ask myself, what already exists in my Zettelkasten that I might want to connect to this? There might be nothing. It's only really for this one example of this very specific thing that I'm using for a specific purpose, and so maybe I can just link to these articles in my juggling as a metaphor and media note, and that's good enough. So that's my answer to Giancarlo's question, and hopefully it helped you as well. I think my key takeaways here are, if you're unsure whether you need a source note, might as well make the source note. However, if you don't think you will use this source outside of one very specific atomic idea in your Zettelkasten, maybe you don't need to make a source note. I think the main question to ask yourself is, am I going to come back to the content of this source again? And if the answer is no, you probably don't need a source note for it. Please send me your questions. I'd love to do more of these short form Zettelkasten question answer type videos, so hopefully I'll see you in another one again soon. Bye everybody.